The river was calm that spring. Too calm, some would later say. In the official patrol ledger of April 1873, a clerk recorded nothing more than the usual notations: water height, cargo traffic, weather conditions. Yet, in the margins of a separate notebook, not meant for formal review, one river watchman wrote a single, careful line. There was the sense of being observed, though nothing stood upon the bank. This took place along the lower Mississippi tributaries, near the Arkansas Delta, a region still adjusting to post-war reconstruction. River patrols at the time were not military units in the strict sense. They were civilian crews contracted to inspect levees, escort commercial barges, and deter smuggling along shallow channels. Most men were former ferrymen, laborers, or veterans, accustomed to long nights on open water. The primary vessel involved was a shallow-draft patrol launch, known locally as the Maribel, a steam-assisted craft operating between Greenville and the smaller logging settlements upriver. Her crew numbered 6, Captain Elias Moore, age 42, First Mate Thomas Rourke, Engineer Samuel Vickers, and 3 rotating watchmen, Henry Cobb, Isaac Dent, and young apprentice Walter Price, newly hired that winter. Daily life aboard the Maribel was repetitive and practical. Mornings were spent checking levee posts and measuring erosion. Afternoons passed with slow navigation through reed-choked channels. At night, the vessel often anchored near bends where the current slackened. Lanterns were hung low. Engines were dampened. Conversation stayed quiet to avoid disturbing nearby settlements. In early April, the river had risen beyond seasonal norms. Snowmelt from the north fed the tributaries, darkening the water and carrying debris downstream. Floating branches, uprooted stumps, and occasional livestock carcasses were not uncommon. Patrol crews were instructed to remain vigilant, as submerged hazards posed serious risks. It was during this period that the first unusual remarks began to appear in personal correspondence. A letter from First Mate Rourke to his brother, dated April 9th, mentions fatigue and odd reflections at night when the fog settles close to the surface. He added, without elaboration, the water gives the impression of holding its breath. None of the crew formally reported disturbances. There were no official complaints, no emergency signals. Yet several men later recalled small changes in routine behavior. Watchmen lingered less at the bow. Lanterns were repositioned to cast light outward across the water rather than inward toward the deck. The crew began rotating night watches more frequently, though no rule required it. Captain Moore, a methodical man known for strict adherence to schedules, noted in the ship's log on April 11th that visibility had been abnormally reflective. The phrase stood out. River surfaces were typically dull under overcast skies. That evening, Moore described faint rippling patterns that moved against the current for brief intervals before vanishing. He did not classify this as a threat. He simply recorded it and continued the route. By April 13th, the Maribel anchored near a long, narrow bend bordered by cypress trees and flooded lowland forest. Locals referred to the stretch as Old Sutter's Reach. It was isolated. No settlements lay within several miles. According to later testimony gathered by regional newspapers, this was the first night several crew members felt distinctly unsettled. Not frightened, not alarmed, only unsettled. Henry Cobb would later say, the silence felt arranged. Walter Price, still new to river work, described the sensation of standing watch while sensing movement where none could be seen. No shapes, no sounds, only the steady presence of the dark waterline stretching unbroken into the distance. At the time, none of them understood these feelings as warnings. They treated them as fatigued nerves or the strain of long hours. But the river patrol would not leave Old Sutter's Reach unchanged, and by morning, subtle irregularities would begin to appear, small enough to dismiss, yet persistent enough to be remembered. The morning of April 14th arrived without ceremony. Fog lifted slowly from the surface of the river, thinning into pale strands that drifted toward the lane. The Maribel's crew resumed routine checks. Steam pressure was brought up. Anchor lines were reeled in. Nothing appeared damaged. Nothing appeared missing. It was engineer Samuel Vickers who first noticed the irregularity. While inspecting the lower intake valve, he reported a thin accumulation of river silt coating the metal housing anuja. Given the vessel had remained stationary through the night, normally, silt settled evenly along the hull. This buildup, however, formed in a narrow band just above the waterline. As though something had repeatedly disturbed the surface at the same height, Captain Moore dismissed the finding as the result of shifting currents. The river was known to behave unpredictably near bends. Still, he instructed the crew to rinse the intake and proceed with caution. They departed Old Sutter's, reached shortly after sunrise. It was less than an hour into the journey when Watchman Isaac Dent called out from the forward deck. He did not shout, he simply asked, calmly, if anyone else could see what he was seeing. According to later statements, Dent was observing a narrow series of ripples traveling parallel to the Maribel's port side. The disturbance did not radiate outward, as boat wakes normally do. Instead, it maintained a fixed distance from the hull, moving in alignment with the vessel's speed. First Mate Rourke leaned over the railing to inspect it. He later described the water as pressed downward in a shallow line, as though a submerged object were displacing the surface without breaking it. The engine was briefly slowed. When the Maribel reduced speed, the ripples slowed as well. When the engine resumed normal output, the ripples matched pace. At this point, practical explanations were offered. Floating timber beneath the surface. A partially submerged log caught in the current. Even a large fish school was suggested. The river supported catfish and sturgeon large enough to disturb surface water under the right conditions. Captain Moore ordered a slight course adjustment toward mid-channel within minutes. The ripples faded. No alarm was raised. But the incident did not leave the crew's thoughts as isolated. Later that afternoon, while passing through another narrow stretch of flooded forest, young Walter Price reported seeing a dark line just below the surface near the starboard side. He initially assumed it was a shadow cast by overhanging branches, yet when the vessel shifted angle relative to the sun, the shape remained fixed. Price hesitated before speaking. When he finally pointed it out, the line had already faded into the murky water. The crew laughed lightly at his unease. Price himself apologized for seeing patterns where there were none. The matter was dropped. That evening, however, a more difficult occurrence was recorded. As dusk settled, Captain Moore ordered the Maribel, anchored once more, this time near a shallow inlet bordered by tall reeds. The engine was shut down. Lanterns were lit. Supper was served in silence. Fatigue pressing heavily after the long day. Shortly after nightfall, Watchman Cobb took the first shift on deck. In his later written account, preserved in a family journal, Cobb stated that the river surface appeared unusually smooth. No insect movement, no drifting debris. The current seemed to slow near the hull, forming a faint circular stillness around the vessel. Then, without warning, a soft impact was felt against the port side. Not a collision, not a strike, more like a gentle pressure, as if something large had brushed the hull and withdrawn. Cobb immediately alerted the bridge. Rourke and Moore came forward with lanterns. They examined the hull from above. No damage was visible. No floating debris drifted past. The water remained calm. Once again, explanations were offered. A submerged log, a shifting anchor chain, river swell rebounding against the steel plating. Yet the crew could not ignore one detail. The pressure had occurred precisely at the waterline, not below, not above, exactly where the river met the vessel. That night, the watch schedule was quietly altered. 2 men remained on deck at all times. Conversation ceased almost entirely. No one spoke of fear. No one used dramatic language. But sleep came poorly. And beneath the slow creak of the anchored hull, several men would later say they sensed movement in the water, steady, patient, and deliberately close. By morning, the Maribel would carry forward not only its cargo logs and inspection reports, but the growing awareness that something along the river was no longer behaving as it should. The following days brought no relief. Instead, the irregularities became more frequent and more difficult to dismiss. On April 16th, the Maribel resumed her scheduled patrol upriver toward a cluster of timber camps. Weather conditions were stable. Visibility was clear. The river, though high, flowed evenly. Yet within hours of departure, the crew again observed surface disturbances near the hull. This time, they occurred on both sides of the vessel. According to the ship's maintenance log, Engineer Vickers reduced engine output twice that morning to investigate vibration patterns. He could not attribute to the boiler or propeller shaft. Each time the engine slowed, the vibrations eased, but the water disturbances persisted, maintaining their slow, parallel motion alongside the craft. First Mate Rourke attempted to measure the distance visually by lowering a weighted rope into the water. He reported no contact with any solid object. The line sank freely into the murk without obstruction. Captain Moore, increasingly uneasy but unwilling to alarm nearby settlements without cause, instructed the crew to continue operations while recording every irregularity. By midday, the atmosphere aboard the Maribel had changed. Watchmen no longer leaned over the rail. When spoken to, several crew members answered briefly and avoided eye contact. Price, normally eager to assist with routine tasks, requested to remain in the engine compartment rather than rotate to deck duty. The next disturbance occurred shortly after sunset. As the vessel approached a narrow bend surrounded by dense tree cover, the river ahead appeared unnaturally dark, darker than the shaded water behind them. Cobb, stationed at the bow, reported that the surface seemed flattened, lacking the usual rippling texture produced by moving current. Then the Maribel began to slow, not due to engine failure, not due to grounding. The vessel behaved as though moving against a gentle but persistent resistance. Steam pressure remained stable. The propeller turned normally, yet forward motion decreased. Captain Moore ordered additional power. The engine responded. The resistance eased gradually, not suddenly, as if releasing tension. Moments later, a series of low disturbances appeared ahead of the bow, wide, slow-moving ripples that parted outward, then vanished. No debris surfaced. No obstruction was recovered. That night, the crew anchored earlier than scheduled. The decision was made quietly, without formal discussion. Lanterns were kept low. The engine remained warm, not fully shut down, allowing for rapid departure if necessary. It was during the late watch between midnight and 1 o'clock that the most troubling observation occurred. Watchman Dent reported seeing movement along the waterline on the starboard side. When questioned, he described it not as a shape, but as a shifting boundary where reflection met darkness. He stated that the line appeared to rise and fall slightly, as though following a slow rhythm. Rourke joined him on deck. Both men observed the phenomenon for nearly a minute. Neither could identify a source. When Dent reached down with a lantern, angling light toward the surface, the reflective line dispersed instantly, leaving only still water behind. After this, Captain Moore ordered all hands to remain alert and restricted unnecessary movement during night hours. Sleep became fragmented. Meals were eaten quickly. Conversation centered only on practical duties. And though no direct threat had yet presented itself, the crew began to share an unspoken understanding. Whatever disturbances were occurring were not isolated accidents. They were repeating. They were adapting to the vessel's movement, and they were increasingly focused at one specific place, the waterline. By the time the Maribel turned back downstream toward Greenville, the men aboard were no longer debating whether something unusual was happening. They were now waiting for it to happen again, and waiting as the river carried them forward in slow, quiet certainty proved far more difficult than any sudden shock could have been. The Maribel entered the lower channel just before dusk on April 19th. This section of river was broader and slower, bordered by long, open banks rather than dense forests. Ordinarily, this stretch brought relief to patrol crews. Visibility improved. Currents were predictable. Navigation required less constant adjustment. That evening, however, the openness offered no comfort. shortly after anchoring near a sandbar used frequently by trading boats. Engineer Vickers reported irregular pressure fluctuations in the steam line. The readings were minor, but inconsistent. He later stated that the fluctuations coincided with faint vibrations along the hull, too subtle to feel underfoot, but detectable through the metal piping. Captain Moore ordered a full systems check, while the engineer and first mate inspected below deck. 2 watchmen remained on the bow with lanterns. The river's surface appeared undisturbed. No ripples, no drifting debris. Then, without warning, the vessel shifted. Not violently, not enough to throw anyone off balance, but enough to be felt by every man aboard. It was described as a slow, lateral movement, as though the hull had been nudged sideways and then released. The anchor line tightened briefly and then slackened. Cobb called down from the bow that the water near the port side had begun moving in a circular pattern, rotating outward from a point just beneath the surface. The motion was steady and controlled, not chaotic like ordinary eddies. Moore rushed back to the deck. Several crew members later testified that at this moment, the waterline along the port side appeared distorted, its reflection bending downward in a narrow vertical band. Lantern light refracted oddly, creating the impression of depth where there should have been flat surface. Then came the sound. Not a splash, not a strike, a low, drawn-out pressure. Noise like wood flexing underwater carried faintly along the hull. It lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough. Captain Moore ordered the anchor raised immediately. Steam was brought up to full operational pressure. The Maribel began moving forward, slowly at first, then faster as the engine responded. As the vessel gained speed, multiple disturbances appeared on both sides of the hull. Crewmen described parallel ripples forming simultaneously along the waterline, maintaining consistent spacing from the vessel as it moved. One watchman reported seeing a dark mass briefly surface no more than a foot above the water before submerging again. Though no defining features were observed, no one shouted, no one panicked. But several men later admitted their hands were shaking as they gripped the railings. For nearly 10 minutes, the disturbances persisted. Then, gradually, they fell away. The river returned to its usual pattern. Normal current resumed. The hull vibrations ceased. The Maribel continued downstream without stopping. No one suggested anchoring again that night. When the vessel finally docked near Greenville at dawn, the crew disembarked in near silence. Captain Moore filed no emergency report. There was no category for what had occurred. Instead, he submitted routine inspection notes and quietly requested reassignment to upper river routes. Privately, however, the crew met later that morning in a nearby boarding house. According to Rourke's later recollection, this was the first time the men spoke openly about what they believed had happened. Not of monsters, not of spirits, only of the shared certainty that something in the river had behaved with intention. It had approached, it had matched their movement, and it had applied pressure where the vessel was most exposed. The breaking point had not been fear, it had been recognition. And once recognized, the sense of safety they had carried onto the river was gone. What remained would follow them long after the Maribel left the water behind. The days after the Maribel's return were strange, not because of public panic, but because of the quiet withdrawal of her crew. Captain Moore's request for reassignment was approved in a week. He seemed reserved, avoiding conversation and refusing any more river postings. First Mate Rourke left the patrol service entirely, taking a job at a dry dock, saying he preferred solid ground and predictable noise. Engineer Vickers stayed but avoided night routes, obsessively journaling every minor mechanical issue, often mentioning water interference. The younger crew were also deeply affected. Apprentice Walter Price went home and refused any work involving boats, claiming, "The river remembers who watch us it." Despite these reactions, no official investigation happened. There was no damage, no lost cargo, no injuries. But the story traveled. Other crews started avoiding that part of the river. The water was just a route, but now it felt like something that could respond. And that realization never left the men of the In the years that followed, The incident aboard the Maribel did not disappear entirely. It lingered quietly in fragments, scattered across private letters, margin notes, family journals, and second-hand recollections gathered long after the men involved had grown old. I've grown old or passed on. No official river authority archive lists an anomaly at Old Sutter's Reach in 1873. Patrol ledgers from that season show nothing more than routine water measurements and cargo escorts. Yet among personal collections preserved by descendants, several documents remain consistent in their descriptions. The recurring detail is not a creature, not a form, not even a sound. It is the behavior of the water itself. One survivor notebook, attributed to Engineer Vickers, includes a brief technical observation written months after the event. Disturbance patterns matched vessel speed and adjusted with engine output. No mechanical source identified. Another letter, believed to be from Henry Cobb to a cousin in Tennessee, contains only a single reference. There are places where the river does not behave as a thing carried by gravity alone. Local newspapers from the late 1800s printed occasional short notices about unusual currents near the Arkansas Delta Bend, but none offered explanation. Editors treated the reports as natural irregularities, seasonal flooding effects, sediment shifts, or underwater obstructions that were never properly charted. And yet, the same stretch of river continued to accumulate quiet avoidance. By the early 20th century, steamboat captains favored alternate anchoring sites. Fishing boats rarely remained overnight near Old Sutter's Reach. Oral accounts collected by regional historians describe elders advising younger men not to linger there after dark, though no specific reason was ever openly given. What is notable is the absence of escalation. There were no later attacks, no confirmed losses, no visible evidence that something continued to actively pursue vessels. Only the persistence of altered behavior, silence, and subtle caution pass from one generation to the next. Captain Moore never publicly revisited the incident. He died in 1902, his personal papers offering no further clarification beyond the single letter already known. Rourke remained employed in dry dock work until his retirement, speaking rarely of his years on open water. Price left the river towns altogether and settled inland, far from navigable waterways. None of them claimed certainty. None offered conclusions. They did not describe monsters or unknown beings. They described timing, pressure, movement that adjusted rather than collided, and water that seemed, briefly, aware of the vessel passing through it. Today, Old Sutter's Reach looks no different from countless other river bends. Cypress trees still lean toward the surface. Fog still settles low at dawn. Barges pass without incident. Patrol routes continue uninterrupted. There is no marker, no sign, no official memory of what occurred in 1873. Only the surviving accounts, and the quiet suggestion, preserved in fading ink and reluctant testimony, that on certain nights, in certain places, the river may behave in ways that resist simple explanation. Not violently, not dramatically, just enough to be noticed, and just subtle enough to remain unanswered.